Welcome everybody to Contrarian Island. On today's show, I have Hadley Ford, who is the CEO of Ianthus Capital Holdings. Hadley is actually our first guest on the Cannabis series within Contrarian Island. If you go back and listen to the season 2 intro episode, I discuss how Contrarian Island is going to have 2 parts to it, one part being Bitcoin, one part being cannabis. And Hadley is our first guest on the cannabis side, and what a great guest he was. He did a fantastic job explaining the vision of Ianthus, how he got into the cannabis space, and where he sees the sector going in the next few years. I really hope all of you enjoy this episode as much as I did. For full disclosure, I do hold shares in Ianthus. I think it's a great company. I'm long, have no plans of selling anytime soon. And this episode is brought to you by 420newsletter.com. Make sure you go to 420newsletter.com. Subscribe, it's free. Every single day, Monday through Friday at 420, you'll receive an update on what happened that day in the markets, email, newsletter, straight to your inbox. Enjoy this episode, and thanks for tuning in. Welcome everybody to Contrarian Island. Today I have Hadley Ford, the CEO of Ianthus Capital, on the show. How are you, Hadley?
I am absolutely fantastic today. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Yeah, very exciting news today out of Ianthus involving Massachusetts and their Mayflower retail store there, and we'll get into that later in the show. But real quickly, I wanted to jump in first. Hadley, how did you first get involved in the cannabis space, and what were you doing before?
Well, it's kind of the family business. If you go back to the '60s, my parents actually had what they told my grandmother were French marigolds growing on the old family farm. So it goes back a ways. But more recently, my brother was the largest medical operator in New Mexico. I think he got a license 7 or 8 years ago, and my sister had a licensed operation in Vermont. She probably got a license 5-ish years ago. So it was in the genes of the family, and we all thought it was pretty funny. The two of them were in the cannabis business. And then my brother lent my sister a bunch of money, and then his business took off and he wanted it back. But of course, she'd put it into lights and grow facilities, and it was kind of already sunk into the operation. And I actually had to get involved as the peacemaker so that we could all have Thanksgiving dinner together. And at the time, I didn't really know that much about the cannabis business from a capital perspective. So I said to my brother, why don't you just borrow money from the bank? Like, why do you have to do all this cash stuff? And he said, silly big brother, you can't do that in cannabis. And my background had been predominantly in corporate finance, M&A, things like that on Wall Street. And I found it fascinating within the world of cannabis that there wasn't a financing solution. So I started poking around and looking at that. And that's how I got involved in the business, really from solving a problem for my brother and sister.
Awesome. And then what inspired the creation of Ianthus in particular, and what was the thought process there when you decided you want to take the jump and run this
Oh,
company?
sure. Yeah. So I had been sort of casting about. I had been in the healthcare business and had left a previous company that I had started up to look for some other growth opportunities. And it was right around the same time I was solving this problem for my brother and sister. And I got a phone call from a guy I'd done a lot of business with when I was working at Goldman Sachs. And he said, what are you up to? And I told him the story about healthcare and whatnot. And I said I was out looking for the next big growth opportunity. And he said that he'd found that. And this is a guy who made a lot of money in ones and zeros. He'd been very early in online travel. He's one of the first guys in what ultimately became XL Communication. It's actually how I got to know him when I was at Goldman. We invested in his company and I sat on his board. And then he'd also started up a company called IGE, which had been the largest virtual currency trader on the planet before anyone even had heard about Bitcoin. But he had said that he found this. So I thought I was expecting to hear about ones and zeros or technology, and I was out looking for a growth thing. So I said, "Yeah, what have you found?" And he said cannabis, and I laughed. And he said, "Why are you laughing?" I told him about my brother and sister and how it was the family business. And he said, "Well, why aren't you in the family business?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really sure how you scale cannabis. It's more like the high-end restaurant business. At the time, you'd raise some money from friends and family, and you'd have a license, which gave you an opportunity to sell cannabis in a region or a state. But you couldn't ship stuff across state lines. You couldn't trademark your name. Just a lot of issues on a scalable perspective." And he said, "Well, we always like working with each other. Why don't we try and find a business model that makes sense?" So it's probably 5-ish years ago, and he and I traveled around the U.S. We spent time with my brother and my sister, and met with a lot of other operators. Went to a lot of conferences, and we determined two key things, which seem somewhat quaint in retrospect, but at the time were the genesis for creating Ianthus. The first was, as my brother and sister had educated me, there wasn't any regular way capital for the cannabis entrepreneur in the United States. So you weren't going to get Citibank to give you a prime plus two loan. The second piece, a little more subtle, but ultimately more important, was because the money wasn't flowing in from the regular channels into cannabis. You didn't have all the attendant camp followers show up. You didn't have bankers, lawyers, consultants. You didn't have that young VP out of Procter and Gamble to come be your head of marketing. So you had this strange situation where cannabis entrepreneurs across the United States had had a license to sell cannabis, but they didn't have access to money or resources. So our original thought was we'd set up a private fund and we would invest in great operators and charge 2 and 20, sit on some boards, have a good time. But we quickly found two problems with that model. One, for the same reason Citibank wasn't giving out prime plus two loans, you weren't going to get Toronto teachers or CalPERS to give you a $200 million blank check into a fund. And the second piece, despite the fact I love my brother and sister very much, you weren't going to find a lot of great operators across the United States. It's a very nascent business. Most people were coming out of the illegal market, didn't have a lot of business savvy, and you're going to have to be a lot more involved in the company building aspects of it than just finding people that you could back. So we morphed our model at that point. We randomly were up in Canada and stumbled across the Canadian public markets. This is 5 years ago, and at the time, I think there were seven public cannabis companies in Canada with a collective market cap of less than $1 billion.
Wow.
But important, yeah, it was. But this was an important bright light that went off because it was legal in Canada. You had a function in capital markets. And it was really the only capital market anywhere on the planet that showed a willingness to actually finance cannabis. Now, at that point, I think only $150 million had been raised in the public markets in Canada. That's Canadian dollars, so it was like 120 million US. But it had been done, and there were traders and salespeople and bankers and lawyers and accountants that were all comfortable, and investors, importantly, all comfortable with the concept of cannabis company. So we posited the idea that perhaps you could have a Canadian vehicle that educated the Canadian investor on the opportunity in the United States. And we spent about a year going around to banks and investors in Canada, and no one, they thought we were nuts.
Yeah.
Because, isn't this illegal in the United States? Yes, it is. But here's why. At the time you had the Cole memo, and here's how you could do it. And we couldn't get a bank to work with us. We couldn't get lawyers we couldn't get anyone to work with us. But we thought it was a great idea. So we actually did it ourselves. We actually took ourselves public, just like the same thing. If you see like a really cool car driving down the road, you go, "Wow, I want that car," but you can't find a place to buy it. You could actually go make that car if you wanted. It was the same type of thing. So we
Right.
actually drafted up all the legal documents. We did all the filings ourselves, and ultimately just took ourselves public without a bank. We ultimately got a lawyer and accounting firm to work with us because you do need those components to be able to file. But without a bank, we took ourselves public, which was a lot of fun, a lot of challenges, and it took. I originally thought it'd take about 6 months, but it took about a year and change to do that. But we were the first U.S. multi-state operator to go public, and we did that about 3 years ago. And I think the first day we were public, We traded 500 shares, and there was days in the first quarter we were public where we didn't trade any shares at all because nobody believed in the opportunity in the United States from that public entity perspective, which seems kind of crazy in retrospect, given everyone who smoked a joint has gone public now.
Right.
Uh, but that was the genesis of it. We used that public platform to ultimately raise hundreds of billions of dollars, buy licenses in different states, and now we have operations across 11 states, and we have a retail presence in I guess 9 of those.
Incredible. Great founding story there. And I wanted to go into detail now about the whole MSO structure and everything being vertically integrated. How does that work?
Mm-hmm.
Do you find difficulty with having to produce everything from seed to sale? Do you prefer it that way? And do you think it's going to be like that in the future as well?
Well, it's an interesting question because the vertical integration that has advantages, has had disadvantages, but the quirk you have in cannabis is you have to be vertically integrated in every state. So a lot of companies are vertically integrated. They make I don't know where General Mills makes Cheerios anymore, but let's say they make Cheerios in one place and they ship them around the planet, so they're vertically integrated at least to the production and distribution and shipping and whatnot. But in cannabis, you can't do that. You
Yeah,
actually have to make the Cheerios in every single
right.
state, and you have to grow the corn or the wheat for the Cheerios, for the sugar and the and whatnot. So it's a little bit strange, and it makes it tough, right? Because everybody's holy grail is to create products that customers are going to desire, and to do that, you have to have a product that has continuity and is the same everywhere, right? You can't have chocolate taste differently in Massachusetts than it does in Colorado. But if we have to manufacture a product in all 11 states in which we operate, that raises all sorts of issues around how similar can you make that? How much money do you want to spend to make that similar? Because we all know what's going to happen down the road, right? You're going to have federal legalization. You're going to be able to centralize your production. You may actually have contract manufacturers that can make some products. So the whole infrastructure of the industry will change over the next 5 to 10 years. But today, you have to grow, you have to extract, you have to formulate, you have to manufacture, you have to package, you have to sell, you have to distribute, and you have to do that everywhere. And there's not a lot of stuff written on that because people think, oh, okay, making a joint here, making a joint there, making a pen here, making a pen there. Oh, okay, how hard can that be? But it's hard. I mean, when we were interviewing folks for our marketing team, we talked with someone who had been responsible for moving the Nestle's Crunch factory, which used to be in Brooklyn, down to Brazil. And he told me that it took them 3 years before they QA/QC'd the Nestle's
Wow.
Crunch bar back to how it was in Brooklyn. So this is a multi-billion-dollar, multinational consumer product good company with one product that they've made for over 100 years, and they have that difficulty of manufacturing and getting this exact same product. Now they're going to work to much more exacting standards, than you're able to in cannabis today, just given some of the industry supply constraints because of the federal illegality. But still, to think that you could make the same product exactly the same in 11 states, that's you're never going to be able to do that. But then the interesting question is, how close to perfection do you want to be? Because you could spend hundreds of millions of dollars and get down to you know less than 1% variance, or you could spend no money and have like 50%
Right.
variance. And on that scale is where you need to choose, and that has implications on cost of capital and dilution, and kind of what your view of the future is. So I find that piece of the puzzle endlessly fascinating, not just from a delighting your customer perspective, but from a planning perspective and a business perspective.
Yeah, I can imagine. Must be a lot of moving parts there for sure. So, Ianthus has been in the news a lot lately. There's been a lot of developments, and one of the big ones, more recent ones, is MPX. So, I wanted to see if you could give us some background on the MPX deal and why investors should be excited about that.
Oh, sure. It's anything you ever do in an M&A context has to be driven by strategy. And there's three reasons that we would ever do something from a strategic acquisition perspective. The first is to expand our footprint. Actually, I'll back up from that. So our strategy is pretty straightforward. We want to have an adequate enough footprint on a national basis. Think about it being in the MBA cities, that we have a retail presence where we can attract customers, delight them with that retail experience while they're in our stores being delighted and learning about cannabis. They buy something, and then they buy it again, and they buy it again, and they buy it again, and over time it begins to mean something to them within their life, and that becomes what we talk about as a brand. And that's where you want to be at the end of the day, is owning and selling a portfolio of brands that consumers and patients can't live without. And that's how we think we can create the most value for our shareholders, the most value within the context of society, providing those products that actually meet a need that's desired by patients and customers. So then that will drive our M&A strategy, which will then be to expand that footprint into cities that matter, so we can have that retail presence to actually drive brand awareness. The second piece would be something that had you access to a brand or a product that was unique, something that consumers have already shown a willingness to pay a premium for. And that was the Melting Point extract brand, MPX itself, that the company changed its name to. So MPX is a brand that is distributed into 110 stores beyond our own. It's well received. It commands probably a 20% premium. People ask for it by name. So to have access to that brand allow us to then manufacture that and distribute that into new markets is another reason that we want to do something from a strategic perspective. And the third piece is really cost of capital. Having the breadth and scope and scale can reduce the cost of raising capital, from a public perspective or a private perspective. So any one of those three things might be a reason or a rationale for doing something from a strategic perspective. MPX checked all those boxes. I think we were in 6 states at the time. Post MPX, net of some of the overlap, we got into 11 states. We pick up the MPX brand, and the broader scope and scale that we have with the company has allowed us to access capital in a more cost-effective manner. So those are the reasons and rationales behind it.
Awesome, really exciting news. And then it was followed up by CBD for Life. So do you want to give some background on the CBD
Yeah,
for Life deal?
sure. So CBD is that's like the hoopla within the cannabis world right now, because people who aren't comfortable with THC can play in the CBD world. So big retailers and big CPG companies, beverage companies, whatnot, they can all get involved in cannabis light, CBD. And we've seen wags out in the press, called CBD the gateway drug to THC. So they can all get in and learn about that. So from our perspective, it's an augment to our core business. It's essentially a cannabis product without the psychoactive component of it. So within the world of cannabis, we were making very low THC or non-THC products anyway. So the idea is, okay, what's a little bit different about the CBD piece, and why would you want to own a separate division of CBD? A couple of reasons. One, I do think that the way CBD is manufactured, shipped, distributed, marketed is the future of THC. Right? CBD, you can use a contract manufacturer. You can ship across state lines. You can advertise and market. So getting familiar with that type of business model is very important. The other piece is, because it's CBD, when you're out selling, you can have relationships with people who wouldn't talk to you if you were THC. So we're in, I think, over 1,100, 1,200 stores nationwide. So we're able to have discussions about a cannabis product, CBD, with distributors, with retailers like Dillard's, and you wouldn't be able to do that. So it allows you to start to develop those relationships that you can't have from a THC perspective. And the third piece of the puzzle is really the advertising and marketing side. So we're able to actually sell online. We're able to advertise, market, just do a lot of things you can't do with THC that allows you to start to plow the field from a brand perspective ahead of time to a time and place in the future when THC would be available. So those are the strategic reasons, rationales that would drive that. There was also component that one of the founders, Julie Winters, is a very competent and good manager, and getting real management talent within the world of cannabis is one of the scarce resources. And anytime you can find someone who's a good manager, thoughtful, and you can add them to your team, that's a win-win. So those are the reasons that that transaction made sense for us.
Definitely, I've been seeing a lot of positive news out of the CBD for Life expansion. I believe Urban Outfitters as well
Yeah,
is one of
absolutely.
the characters that's
Yep.
great news there. And then on the other front, it's retail, and there's been a lot of expansion on the retail side. New stores
Mm-hmm.
opening in Florida.
Yep.
I know you have B, and then today with the Massachusetts news. Can you give us more insight in what your strategy is from a retail perspective?
Oh, sure. And it's a little bit odd in this day and age. Imagine if I was launching a new sneaker and you're interviewing me about this new sneaker. And you say, Hadley, how'd you come up with the idea? And I say, well, I bought a 10,000 page book on the sneaker demographics. I identified a unique opportunity within that. I went online and I hired a designer out of Italy, and I got a
Right.
contract manufacturer out of China, and I called IMG and got some celebrity sponsors. And I could do that all from my apartment in New York. And then I'd launch this sneaker company. And then I would say to you, but our real secret sauce is I'm going to build out a bunch of bricks and mortar stores to sell them in. And then you say, well, that's pretty contrary for a contrary island.
Yeah.
So because cannabis is against the law on the federal basis here in the U.S., you had this weird construct that a 1936 business model makes sense. We can't advertise, we can't market. If you use social media too aggressively, you get kicked off. There's no contract manufacturers. There's no nation or regional distributors to take your product. You have to do all that yourself. And the only way you can really educate and get a consumer comfortable with cannabis is in a retail store. I can't put a flyer or a circular in the New York Times and have it show up on their doorstep on a Sunday. I can't, go stalk their Instagram with influencers that are mentioning us by name and they want to go to the store. But you can't do that. So you have to have a retail store. Um, and you have to drive customer traffic to that retail store, which is where they come and where they learn about cannabis, where they're delighted by an experience, and then hopefully they come back to your store over and over again and they start to buy your products. um, it's an interesting business model.
Yeah.
It's probably the only product growth area that is dependent on bricks and mortars, and everyone else is sort of moving away from bricks and mortars into all sorts of online strategies. And I think ultimately cannabis will move that way when you have a federal legal environment, and you can use some of the more usual channels for sales and distribution. But because of that, retail is extremely important in developing that brand awareness. So we look for very high profile locations. We look to be in cities that have good demographics and population. I referenced earlier kind of the MBA rule. So you want to be in cities that matter. So we've got a great store location in Brooklyn, right across from the Barclays Center. We have a great store in Boston, um, right in the middle of where all the student housing is. Um, and then down in Florida, I think we've opened 5 or 6 stores year to date. And we're very excited. We have a Miami opening coming beginning of August as well. So that retail component allows us to build a relationship with the patient and the customer, allow them to come back and learn about cannabis, how it can influence and change their life, both from a health perspective as well as from just a lifestyle perspective. And that's the beginning of the marketing component that you have, the relationship that you have with your customer.
Definitely, and that's actually one of the things that gets me so excited about Ianthus is I could tell you location is a top priority, and if you actually go through and see where the stores are located, they're in really good areas, good cities, high foot traffic, and yeah, as a Miami patient, I'm very excited for the Miami opening. Have you released where that's going to be available? On It's going to be in Biscayne, that store.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's going to be in Biscayne.
Awesome. So
I'd love to when we open. I'd love to have you to the grand opening, and we could do a live podcast from
definitely,
there.
I would love to be there. And for those of you not from Miami, Biscayne is the busiest and most popular street down here in South Florida. So should be exciting to have that open up there. Now I wanted to look a little more into the future. What are your top priorities for the rest of the year for Ianthus?
Well, we set our objectives annually. Our key objectives for this year, we're building out what we call Team Ianthus, so ensuring that we have the best workforce in the industry. Second one is it's an old saw, you can't manage something if you can't measure it. So we're in the process of standardizing and rolling out ERP system through all of our markets. The third piece is that cost of capital component, always trying to ensure that we've got access to capital that is both at hand but also cost effective. The fourth piece, it gets back to the component I was saying from a strategic perspective, you have to be able to make things the same in every state. So putting in the processes and the mindset of operational replication across all of our markets. And then the fourth piece is on top of everything that I just said, your footprint and your capital and your operational prowess, you got to layer that brand piece. You have to begin to build the framework and infrastructure of those iconic brands. So those are the five key things that we had set for the year. Those haven't changed at all over the course of the year. We then set some specific goals we need to get done every quarter as a company, and then the management team and employees sort of drive to get those done. So, we've got a number of things we're trying to get done in this upcoming quarter. But they all drive to those five objectives. They'll be around probably the first three are driving things more than the next two right now. So, building out that great team, just focused on hiring the right people, training the right people, building that culture of excellence. And I think that's really the only long-term differentiator a company has. Everything else can be copied, right? We have a great location in Biscayne. Someone could put a store up right next to us.
Right.
Make a great product. Someone could copy that product, but you can't copy your people. So that will likely always be our number one focus. The second piece is that measurement piece. As I said earlier, if you're going to be making the same product everywhere, well, how are you going to test that that's even true? So, you want to make sure that your inputs and your outputs, that you have continuity to compare and contrast that. Management, pay attention to your expenses. So getting that piece done, that infrastructure piece is very important. So as a matter of fact, all that infrastructure piece, almost the boring part, there's nothing really to do with cannabis per se. But that's going to allow anyone who focuses on it, and that's why we're focused on it, the ability to scale. But the opportunity here isn't to be several billions of dollars. The opportunity here is to be 30 or $40 billion company, but you can't get that type of scale unless you have the appropriate infrastructure in place to do that. So that's really our emphasis throughout the year, and it's our emphasis going forward to the second half of the year.
Sounds like a fantastic approach. And I guess within that, what would you say is the biggest obstacle for the company?
I think the biggest obstacle is still, finding the right people. I gave a keynote speech at Benzinga, I think it was in January or February, and they asked me to look into the future. And one of the things I said was that the competition for really top managers and great people is going to increase because people are going to recognize that is the only way to grow. And you have many, many, many more companies coming uh, into uh, into being, whether they're MSOs or ancillary providers of services, and that's going to put a lot of strain on the talent pool. There's a lot more people coming out of mainstream industry today than there were 5 years ago, but it's still a much more narrow pool of talent than if you were in kind of some tech business or something a little more mainstream and federally legal. So there's still a lot of questions in sort of the mainstream talent pool about what's this going to do to my career if it doesn't work, or do I really want to leave something to go into cannabis? And that's the toughest piece, right? Is finding great people and getting them into your company and making sure that fit is correct.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think when the switch does happen, the growth is going to be rapid there. I saw a little blip of it, the past few years in cryptocurrency with big tech and big VCs getting involved, and then when
Yeah.
that happens, it's a rush. And I think cannabis is going to have that moment. And it's hard when you look across the spectrum to find another industry that has as much growth opportunity as cannabis. And I think those are the most exciting industries to be involved with.
No, that is true, and I think the growth and profile is drawing a lot more professionals into the business. I mean, we're reconstituting our board right now. Post merger, we have a very inside packed board, and we want to have a fully independent board by the end of the third quarter into the fourth quarter. And just the candidates that we're interviewing from a board perspective, they wouldn't have talked to us even 12 months ago. And now, there's interest and we're seeing some really good and strong candidates. It's the same from a general manager perspective. We're hiring people into various states. We just got this license in Jersey, and we've had great candidates that we could interview, and ultimately got a great guy who's going to be joining us fairly soon. And
Fantastic.
someone like that never would have spoken to us 3 years ago. So, 3 years 3 years ago, you were begging people to
Yeah.
sort of come into the business, or you were trying to convince people from the illegal market that it's okay to be in the legal market. So we're seeing the change, but that still tends to be one of the bigger challenges in the business.
And you've been in the industry now, one of the early adopters to the space. What is one thing about the cannabis industry that surprised you?
Um, Well, we were chatting a little bit about it before we started the podcast. I guess the biggest surprise thing is from the outside, like, wow, this must be the fastest growing, everything changes every day type of business. And on one hand, it is. There's always twists and turns like you have in any early stage industry that's growing very rapidly. But the part that's surprising is how long some of this stuff takes. I mean, you look at Massachusetts in particular. I think the I think the program has been in place 4 years, and the original program was supposed to be a full rec program, and I think it got voted on the same day that it got voted on in Nevada. And Nevada's had full rec up and running for like a year and a half, almost 2 years. And it's I think there's still only like 7 stores open in
Yeah.
Massachusetts that are full rec. You're like, if you're in Nevada, you're like, wow, the pace of change is really fast. If you're in Mass, you're like, well, maybe not so much. And that's the surprising thing is how different it is state to state, how the pace of change can go from 100 miles per hour to zero, how 180s can happen. People often say, wow, isn't the regulatory risk really tough in cannabis? And they're always referring to the federal illegality of it.
Yeah,
And that I don't even think about that risk. The biggest risk is the local regulatory component, because it's different in every state, and that can change on a whim. Some politician decides they're going to look out for their brother-in-law, and next thing you know,
yeah,
you can't stay open past 5 p.m. So that's probably what's been most surprising is the speed aspect, how it can be really fast in one place and really slow in another.
definitely. And where do you see the industry as a whole in the next decade, and where would you like to see Ianthus positioned in the next decade?
I'd like to see us as the greatest cannabis company on the planet.
Amazing.
Uh, Define that as owning a portfolio of brands that customers and patients can't live without. Um, I think the industry will move toward that. I think it ultimately has to look pretty much like any of the other consumer packaged good or alcohol businesses, that um, where brand matters, where products matter in somebody's life. And I think you'll see um, federal legality, which will then have implications on where cannabis is grown, where cannabis products are manufactured, shipping, distribution. All of that's going to shift and change over the next decade. There'll be unintended consequences to it. There'll be lobbying efforts to protect different aspects of that. It's going to be fascinating, absolutely fascinating change. And we look forward to staying nimble and quick and benefiting our shareholders when those changes occur.
Cannot wait for that. Ianthus is definitely a huge reason I decided to add cannabis to this podcast. I've been really excited about the company, and I really, started my research into the space through finding out about Ianthus from a buddy of mine. But with that, Hadley, you've been a fantastic guest. I really appreciate you jumping on the show, and definitely would love to come by that grand opening when you guys open up in Miami.
Absolutely. Love to have you there. And thanks for having me on the show.
Of course.